2021. If we push it out to 2030, the picture gets even better. So large-scale heat pumps benefit from declines in upfront costs, increase in efficiency, and those networks relying on fossil fuels are hindered by increases in carbon prices. And so what you can see here is district heating is only going to get better in terms of levelized costs compared to individual heating technologies in the UK. So today, this is hosted by Reward Heat. Reward Heat stands for Renewable and Waste Heat Recovery for Competitive District Heating and Cooling Networks. Now you can understand why we use the acronym, but here it is. This is a project that looks across a number of things when it comes to smart and low carbon district heating. It's looked at the innovative technologies to allow flexibility. How do we exploit energy sources in our area? Can we use digital technologies to make district heating smarter and more effective? And finally, the last point, which is the focus of the workshop today, business models and financial schemes to mobilize public and private sector investment. So on a levelized cost basis, it can be cheaper, but we all know upfront costs for district heating are incredibly high. So how can we drive investment in this sector? So I'm going to be joined by Tobias from Stuttgart University, who's a professor there. He's going to speak first. Then we're going to have Olivier, who's a director at Asford Investment Management. And then finally, I'm sure you all know, Gabrielle from Euroheat and Power is going to finish up. That's going to be the presentation components. Now, if you'd like, please populate questions in the chat throughout, and we can have short Q&As after each of the speakers, and then we'll have a larger Q&A at the end. After that, that's when the interactive session begins. So we're going to switch over to a program called Miro. You're going to stay on Teams for the audio, and I can talk you through this. It's a whiteboarding session where we really get input from you as to who are these people, how can we mobilize investors, and I'll dig into that session for you. So a few housekeeping. This session will be recorded. So that's so you're aware, but also in case a colleague has missed it and you want to share, we will be able to provide a link as well as a link to the presentations themselves. And as I said, yeah, there will be a Q&A throughout. So please populate during the presentations, either via the chat or raise your hand, and I can unmute for that. Great, without further ado, I'd hand over to Tobias.
Good morning, everybody. Also from my side, I hope you can hear me, can see me, and also can see my slides. So my task is just to walk you through the issue of sustainable finance and the role sustainable finance and investments play in our project. And Emma just briefly mentioned how difficult it is to finance the high upfront costs of district heating networks and district heating and cooling networks. And that's basically the issue we are working on. So to start with, you might have all taken notice of the global risk report at the beginning of this year at the World Economic Forum. And it was for the second time a wake-up call, because after 2020, once again, the most important risks were the ones, or what to say, threats to the economy, basically, were the ones that were caused by humans, namely man-made climate change. And of course, in comparison to 2020, we also had the pandemic, the corona crisis, infectious diseases. But besides that, the situation hasn't changed. So from a risk manager's perspective, if we transform that like the World Economic Forum did it, if we transform that into a risk matrix, so we see all these climate change related risks in terms of impact and in terms of likelihood are the ones who we have to take, we have to envisage and have to take care first of. So how can we do that, and what might be a roadmap? So what we definitely need is some kind of transformation. We need a decarbonization of our economies, of our businesses. It's no doubt that the climate change belongs to what the Scientific Advisory Board to the government in Germany calls grand challenges. and how can they be tackled. So one starting point might be the SDGs of the United Nations. They might provide for orientation and lead us into this great transformation, which consists of different kinds of transitions. For example, the energy transition, that's what we are talking about today, but also linked to the urban transition, industrial transition, resource transition. And in the end, maybe that will lead us to, in let's say 10, 15 years of time, to a sustainable economy, to a new economic system, maybe a social ecological market economy. But that means also that the companies within these economies need to be transformed themselves. So maybe CSR will become mainstream. Of course, that needs a lot of investments, a lot of efforts to be undertaken. And the question is, where can all the money come from? And here the hypothesis is sustainable finance can provide for that, and sustainable finance can be used or can serve as a catalyst for this transformation. At the right-hand side, you see also sustainable consumption. Why is that important? Because we are the market. And our behavior, our consumer behavior is basically determining what companies are offering. And so it also starts with a change of mindset with all of us, but hopefully converts step by step in our behavior. But coming back to the sustainable finance issue, the framework conditions have changed and have it made more favorably to walk in that direction. Why? Because 3 years ago, the EU started with the EU Action Plan on Financing Sustainable Growth. That was basically the second step, because the first step already in 2015 was the EU CSR Directive. And the first and foremost objective of this action plan is to rechannel capital flows from unsustainable business models in sustainable business models. And sustainable means less carbon intensive. So that is, in my opinion, the game changer. And at the end of 2019, this was supported or complemented also by the European Green Deal. Now, coming out of the economic crisis caused by the pandemic, also the EU recovery plan provides for even more resources in that direction. Or Next Generation EU is a different name for that. And of course, on the national level, for example, in Germany, but all the different member countries of the European Union, of course, we have national climate protection programs that are more or less in line with the Paris Agreement. So we need a lot of money in order to finance all the investments needed, especially in the area of sustainable infrastructure finance. That's the sub-issue we are talking about today. And where does the money come from? And I'm quite positive that if we find the right financial instruments, which are displayed or represented here by the double arrows, if we find the right instruments, we will be successful in channeling the money from sustainable investments into the related products and projects. And sustainable investments, fortunately, has been the fastest growing asset class for the last 15 years on financial markets. Of course, still on small scale, but the changing regulatory environment, like the EU Action Plan, provides for more tailwind. And so that's basically the background of our project. And I will just walk you briefly through the most important steps that we are working on right now. So, of course, at the starting point, we have the demo sites in different European countries, the district heating and cooling networks that are now step-by-step implemented. They have been analyzed and step-by-step be converted in business models. Now we are working on bankability assessments, and that's the starting point for further assessments. So we are using different key performance indicators in order to find out, are they from a technological point of view feasible? Are they from an economic point of view feasible? And above all, how big is the carbon reduction potential? and in order to align that also with investors' interests. Then we step by step try to convert that into investment cases and design financing solutions, and that's basically what we are starting today, networking with investors. So we are very happy to have you here today, and we are looking very much forward to your input. So what are the different investors groups we are targeting at? Of course, it's different kind of banks, it's different kind of investment funds, it's insurance companies and pension funds, and they might be particularly interesting because they are long-term investors, and so they do not have to earn fast returns, and so maybe they are more open for this kind of infrastructure investments. Of course, in addition, international financial institutions and others from other industries, for example, utilities, industrials, and so on, who might also be part of that. So what's the conceptual framework and what are the key performance indicators we are trying to apply in order to translate the different projects in the language and in the mindset of investors? So of course we would like to find out and develop risk-return profiles in order to provide the relevant information on that issue. Of course, liquidity is another important aspect, and last but not least, sustainability, and of course the climate impact, the carbon footprint is the first and foremost indicator in that respect. What kind of infrastructure financing instruments have we looked at so far? Here you see an overview of traditional or conventional infrastructure financing instruments, and for example, green bonds might be one instrument that might work here, or different kind of asset-backed securities, but also kind of hybrid or mezzanine instruments, equity might also work. And that's basically what we would like to find out together with you today. So that's why we are doing the workshop later on and with the Miro board. And like I said, we are looking very much forward to your feedback and your input. I will conclude with basically some kind of a vision we are targeting at. So at the end of the day, in the last phase of the project, what we would like to do is have this table filled, and it links the different financial instruments on the horizontal axis with the different investors groups. So to make it more and more clear what kind of investors would be interested in investing or actually willing to invest in what kind of financial instruments. And since we have quite some time left in this project, what we also would like to do is to design new financial instruments according to your needs, to investors' needs, to develop prototypes that hopefully will add to the spectrum of financial instruments already existing. So we'll be happy to take any further questions if necessary at this point. Otherwise, I would suggest that we just move forward and move to the more interactive part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias. Incredibly interesting. Just a quick question from me. Would you say, so you kind of mentioned the EU plans at the start and that we're, just networking with investors now. You would say we're kind of just at the start of really digging into getting big investment into district heating. Is that fair to say?
That's at least what I hope. For example, the Green Deal is explicitly targeting at infrastructures. And for example, if we look at the carbon footprints of buildings and the carbon footprints of infrastructure, for example, according to the EU taxonomy, they belong to the sectors with the highest carbon footprint. And so my interpretation of what the EU is saying and publishing is that these two sectors belong to the ones which have to be targeted first. And so I'm becoming more and more positive as the action plan proceeds.
Great. I think we all are, or at least hoping so. with that, I'm going to pass over to Olivier, who's going to tell us how they are investing in district heat networks today. So over to you.
Thank you, Emma. I hope you can see me, hear me. Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Olivier Delpont-Deveau. I'm a director at Asper Investment Management. And I'm here to tell you today a bit about our experience as private investors investing in district heating networks in Europe. So first, I will give you a brief introduction to Asper. We are an independent fund management business based in London, and we specialize exclusively in investments in sustainable infrastructure. So we manage about 1.4 billion euros of capital on behalf of, well, mainly institutional investors, so pension funds, insurance companies, funds of funds, sovereign funds. And we'll talk a bit more about our investment strategy a little later today. But I think one thing that's central to everything we do is actually partnering with local management teams and local development teams in every market in which we invest. And then we work very closely with these development teams to implement our investment strategies. And I think this is particularly important and particularly relevant when investing in district heating networks. So a bit about our experience in the sector. So we first invested in district heating in about 2013, 2014, when we made our first investment in Sweden. As you know, Sweden is a very mature district heating market, perhaps the most mature district market out there. What we saw there is also a very fragmented market, so many different assets owned by many different people. A lot of aging assets in need of investment. And so our investment strategy there was to acquire individual district heating networks and invest to improve the operations and enhance the efficiency of the assets. So in order to do this, we set up a new company from scratch. We called it Wasserwärme, and we built the company around a management team with a wealth of experience, technical experience, of course, to be able to operate the assets, but also to identify and implement operational improvements. We built a whole back office function and a business development function in such a way that by the time we sold the business last year to a local industrial player, the asset was Wasserwärme was a fully autonomous business, employing about 25 people, operating 5 district heating networks, biomass fuel district heating networks across the country. And they were also in the process of building a new greenfield district heating network in the outskirts of Stockholm. But this was a very positive experience for us, our first time investing in the sector. And so on the back of this experience, we set out to research other European markets in district heating to find new investment opportunities. And quite quickly, the Netherlands came to be an obvious choice for us. Now, the Netherlands is a very different market to Sweden. It is definitely a nascent market in comparison. But we see, and we saw at the time, and we continue to see today, a lot of potential for investment, lots of investment requirements. And in fact, we see so much investment potential that we have set up a dedicated pool of capital, specifically, whose purpose is specifically to invest in Dutch sustainable district heating. So we've raised that fund last year, and we've been making our first investments. We have invested about 100 million euros in the market since the beginning of this year. And our first investment was in the acquisition of an existing operator of district heating assets called Eve, or Energy voor elkaar, which basically operates an existing recent district heating network in the municipality of Ede in the Netherlands. It employs about 35-40 people. And we are working now with the management team there to also develop and build other greenfield district heating networks across the country. And our aim really is to build a portfolio of sustainable district heating assets and become a leading independent operator of assets in the market. And finally, in terms of our experience, we have, as investment managers, we're also always very keen to be, or we try to be at the forefront of technological advances. And so we were very pleased a couple of years ago to join the D2 Grids project, which is another EU Interreg funded project, who aims to accelerate the rollout of 5th generation district heating and cooling across 5 pilot sites in Northwest Europe. So we are a partner of that project, and helping to shape the business case and assess the investment proposition. So what have we learned from all of this? Well, the first thing I would say is that, and this is the easier bit, that once networks are operational, they present some very attractive infrastructure asset characteristics. So they are large-scale, capex-intensive pieces of infrastructure which offer an essential service to their customers in a cost-effective manner. And in doing so, they generate long-term, stable, often inflation-linked cash flows that are very attractive to infrastructure investors and in other institutional investors. And this is something that quite clearly the investor community has woken up to quite recently. And this graph here on the left is some database that we try and maintain with our own information that depicts essentially transactions that we have seen in the district heating space in Europe over the past few years. And I think that shows this sort of re-rating of district heating as an asset class very clearly. So these are all sort of transactions of district heating, of operational district heating assets in Europe, mainly Scandinavia, France, but a few other countries. And what this shows quite clearly is that since basically 2016, 2017, you're seeing both an acceleration of the number of transactions, so more transactions, also a larger size of transactions. The size of the bubble depicts the relative size of the transaction, so more capital being invested by sort of various types of investors into the sector. And also, quite obviously, the valuations have also been upticking since that 2016-2017 inflection point, where we now see basically valuations in or around 20-25 times EV over EBITDA, and quite stable at that level now. So I think the conclusions from this is basically brownfield or operating district heating networks have no problems attracting capital from institutional investors. In fact, there often are very competitive processes when some assets come to market. Now, it's a very different story when you look at greenfield district heating networks. Now, greenfield district heating networks are, they're a very different type of animal, I would say. They require a very different approach, and that's because it is very difficult to develop and build district heating networks. I've listed a few of the key challenges here, which I'm sure you will all be very familiar with, but these are the things that when I invested in district heating network, I mainly struggle with. The first one is that you are dealing with very often multiple stakeholders. So you need a lot of people to agree and to push in the same direction, and a lot of stars to align to make a district heating network work and get off the ground. And that requires a lot of time and effort, and certainly a dedicated team to do that. The second one is regulatory uncertainty. You find that in the less mature markets, the regulation is often less stable, or is in flux or in development. That certainly is the case in the Netherlands, for example, and that creates, of course, uncertainty. It's not always a bad thing, but it creates uncertainty. You always constantly, as an investor, need to take a look at how it affects the economic feasibility of projects, how it affects the risk profile, and just general feasibility of projects. And then maybe the last one I would mention here is the perceived high risk that Tobias has also referred to, which is the fact that these assets are very usually require a large upfront investment. And by the time that you as an investor commit that capital upfront, you often have quite limited visibility as to what your cash flows are going to be. And that, again, is something that is very important to us as private investors. We are investing other people's capital, and it is impossible for us to take a view on basically building a district heating network and hoping that customers will come it's important for us to have some visibility at least around some initial customers, maybe through anchor loads or something similar. But again, every time we have to work closely with the management team and the development team to get to the right answer. So our approach at Asper, and I've written it here quite conceptually, but relies on really three key pillars. So one is insight, and that is really around understanding really well, as well as possible, the market in which you operate. And this means concretely that before we make an investment in a new market, we will do a lot of research, a lot of analysis to understand the ins and outs of the markets, the risks and the regulation, the competitive tensions, etc. But this also means that we are quite keen, once we make a first investment, to do repeat investments as well, because it becomes easier from that perspective. When you make your second, third, fourth investment, you can build in your learnings from your initial investments, and the feedback loop is very important. You get increasingly comfortable. You can actually accept a perceived higher level of risk. The second one is assets. And this is really about the discipline of project finance, right? These, again, are infrastructure assets. Ultimately, we are infrastructure investors, so we live and breathe project finance. And that means we do a lot of due diligence and financial modeling to make sure we understand what we are investing into. And then the final one, which I think is the more interesting one, is growth. And this really centers around, again, this concept of partnering with a local management team or development team in every market in which we invest, because we believe the best way to really make an investment strategy work and be able to weather uncertainty, capture opportunities, is to build a business around the assets, right? So this is greenfield district heating networks in particular are well suited to this. For this, they are not infrastructure assets in the beginning. They need a lot of capabilities. They need a brain, basically, that is able to react to changes, that is able to hopefully anticipate changes, capture opportunities, redesign, rejuggle the design of the project to meet the changing circumstances. It is hugely important that actually we work very closely with the development team, and I would say the earlier the better, to make projects work. It will be really quite rare for us. In fact, it has never happened that we have invested in a greenfield district heating network that we haven't been closely involved in from the start. So this is an approach that we call infrastructure growth equity, which is a term that we've borrowed from the private equity sector industry. And that's really a mix between infrastructure, as I say, pure infrastructure investments, so the hard assets and the cash flows that come with it, with more private equity sort of growth techniques and levers, like building businesses and setting up a business for growth that I just mentioned. And bringing the two together, which I think is particularly important when you're investing in district heating networks, because you need sort of those capabilities together to make a thesis actually stack up. And so this approach is really sort of our bread and butter. This is what we do every time we invest. And it's something which is particularly well suited for development teams, management teams, entrepreneurs of infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure assets, who have a pipeline of projects and are looking really to accelerate. This is the type of capital that we offer, and hopefully we can help accelerate their growth. And on that note, I will finish here.
Great, thank you so much. It was incredibly interesting to hear about Asper's perspective on the ground. I'd like to pick up, you mentioned anchor loads, which I think has been an interesting transition for district heating. Older networks previously could rely on things like mandatory connections, which obviously in a lot of European markets, including the UK, is not so feasible to, force consumers anymore to sign up to kind of 20-year contracts for heat supply. When you're looking at anchor loads, how much of a proportion do you think, or do you need to be guaranteed to kind of move forward with an investment? Is it you're looking for, a third of the load to be secured, or kind of higher?
Yeah, so it is hugely important. It is really, really the core, I think, of the proposition. And we don't look at the percentage of load, we look at returns. So it doesn't matter if it's 10% or 90%. What we look at is basically, again, the how much money do we actually, how much capital do we invest and commit at the time of let's call it financial close of a project, and what does that anchor load, how much visibility on cash flows does it provide me, and what returns does that get me? So this needs to be a positive return, basically. And then I think the art is really working. Sometimes the numbers are difficult. This is really the difficult bit, I think. And this is why it's important to work really closely with the management team, the development team, to really tweak. And I mean, there's a lot of tweaking and changing of things and variables that actually you can do to try and make the numbers work. And that's really important. It's a very iterative process.
Yeah, of course, it makes a lot of difference, right, between a negative IRR and, you know, a 2% and a 5%, of course. Thank you so much. Last but not least, we have Gabriel from Euroheat and Power, who I'm sure you are all familiar with, who's going to finish up with his presentation before we move to the interactive session.
Yes, thank you, Emma. Good morning, everyone. Can you see my screen? I hope. I don't know if you see yourself, Emma. Well, okay. Yeah, good morning. So time is running out. So I'm Gabriele. For those who don't know me, I work from Euroheat and Power. I'm Project and Sustainable Finance Manager there. So today I'm trying to give a very short overview about this big policy file called EU Taxonomy. Many of you already know it, but I think it's very important also because for us as I would say association defending and advocating district heating industrials interest, we followed a lot this file because we don't have to, I'll say, let the financial world to speak for ourselves. Also in the light of this decarbonization process and this need of leveraging private investment in district heating network. So taxonomy is very complicated policy file. So we should dedicate an entire workshop on this, but so I'll try to do my best. So why EU taxonomy? Which are the reasons behind? So as already Mr. Popovic said, the new Green Deal is one of the biggest, I would say, process which the Commission is putting effort to, and the EU taxonomy is part of it. Decarbonization cannot happen without, I would say, the private investment. So to achieve these EU climate and energy targets for 2030 and 2050, we need more private money. So to do that, we needed some tool to, say, channel and address investment towards the right direction, so towards sustainable projects and activities. And of course, the need for a common language, a clear definition of what is sustainable, what is green was needed. Of course, you can understand that this was a huge task by the Commission, and these, I would say, causes a lot of debate, a lot of different feedback from relevant stakeholders, a lot of discussion also, amongst the member states. So this policy, this taxonomy, became what I like to call it a Frankenstein, where this monster, the Commission lost the control of this policy monster, but finally we had a final, I would say, version, and of course it's much better than, I would say, when it started. So what is this, in detail, this EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy? Basically, is a list of economic activities with the performance criteria for their contribution to 6 environmental objectives. As I said, there's no time to go into detail for all these 6 environmental objectives, so we're gonna focus more on these first 2, the most important ones, so the climate change mitigation and the climate change adaptation. So taxonomy is made up of 2 main, I'll say, elements. So the taxonomy regulation, so the big legislative initiative, I would say, approved already last year by the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, regulating, of course, all, I'll say, the detail of this, taxonomy. So the EU regulation was accompanied by a delegated act. A technical, let's call it, legislation regulating in detail all the screening criteria to, to understand and to identify which kind of activity should be considered in taxonomy, and when this activity can be considered as taxonomy compliant. So the Commission, with the help of experts, decided to some threshold that you can imagine how many, discussion provoked this kind of threshold. So to be considered in the taxonomy, an economic activity should comply with three main elements. So this activity should substantially contribute to at least one of the 6 environmental objectives that we said before. So to contribute to climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and so on. Do not significant harm to any of the other 5 environmental objectives, of course, that's quite natural, and to comply with some minimum safeguards that are, listed in the taxonomy regulation. Just for your information, the regulation was published in the Official Journal of the European Union on the 22nd of June 2020. It entered into force on 12 July 2020, so it's already a reality. And then the first delegated act, enforcing this regulation, was approved very recently on the 21st of April 2021 and formally adopted on 4th of June 2021 after a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, in particular if concerning fossil fuel and gaseous fuel. So who will use this taxonomy? So the regulation has 2 mandatory users: the financial market participants. So they have to comply with the taxonomy regulation if they want to label the financial product as green, and of course the EU member states when they will regulate the financial market, the sustainable finance market in their own country. So but of course, the taxonomy can be used by a long list of relevant stakeholders. For example, also the industrial company, association, so on. But it's not binding. Even though I have to say that the more we go on, the more the taxonomy regulation pops up in other regulatory frameworks, such as the recovery plan and so on. So this the non-binding nature is actually not so well respected by the EU institution. So which kind of sectors are considering taxonomy? Of course, was impossible to consider all kind of economic activities in the world. Should be also, it's already a big, a big challenge. Now, the sectors that are considering the taxonomy are the most polluting ones, so contributing the most to, the greenhouse emissions. And of course, in our case, district heating is considered in the electricity, gas, steam, and air conditioning supply. Some part also in manufacturing. So let's have a look at the first environmental objective. So this, what makes a substantive contribution to climate change mitigation? What does it mean? This means that an economic activity actively contribute to mitigate, to reduce the greenhouse emission. We have basically 3 kinds of activity. The first one are activities that are already low carbon, so they are already compatible with the 2050 objectives. So they are fully compliant with the taxonomy. Then we have the second one, that the activities that contribute to a transition to a zero net emission economy in 2050. So all the threshold to be considered in the taxonomy will be regularly revised in the future. So, for example, building renovation, electricity generation, that at the moment they are not complying with the taxonomy, but they can contribute to, boost this transition, this decarbonization. And then we have the third type of activity that can contribute to this climate change mitigation, activities that enable those above. So are activities that are not complying with the taxonomy if we look at the threshold, but they are needed. They enable this transition. For example, the manufacturing of wind turbines, it's one of the best examples. So to manufacture wind turbines, of course, the emission in the old life cycle assessment are much higher of the, I would say, of those one considering taxonomy, but of course to produce wind-based electricity, for example, we need wind turbines, so it's quite natural. A great debate around taxonomy was, I would say, was about these transitional activities, in particular the role of gas. So what is a transitional activities? Some economic activities that are not taxonomy compliant under certain conditions can be considered environmentally sustainable under taxonomy, but they have to comply with four, I would say, safeguard minimum conditions. So there's no they have to correspond to the best performance in the sector or industry. They, of course, they must not hamper the development and deployment of a low carbon alternative. They, of course, they don't have to lead to a locking carbon intensive assets, I would say, situation, and the technical criteria should be adjusted according to regular intervals. So there was, this transitional activities, for example, was debated around bioenergy. Now it's not anymore a transitional activity; it's fully compliant with taxonomy. Anyway, so. The other big environmental objective is the contribution to climate change adaptation. It's a little bit more complicated, so I will just give you a quick look. So there are activities that are made more climate resilient by integrating measures to perform well under a changing climate. So they don't proactively contribute to reduce the emission, but they help, I would say, economy to be more resilient, to be adapted for a future climate change. So I would maybe skip this slide because we don't have much time. I would like to let the brainstorming session to last more. So this avoiding significant harm is very important. So of course, an economic activity should not hamper the other five environmental objective. It's a natural consequences, of course. And this significant harm principle is one of the most important, of course, in all the taxonomy, and will be used also for the recovery plan investments. So member states have to consider the significant harm principle if they want to invest in green activities financed by the recovery plans. So let's go to our main sector of interest. So what about district heating? District heating is fully considered in taxonomy. Of course, one of the, I would say, a good aspect of this taxonomy compliance for district heating is that compared to other economic activities in the field of energy, district heating has not threshold. So there's not this 100 CO2 gram per kilowatt threshold that it's common. It's quite common in the rest of the other energy-related activities. So the great criteria to be respected by the district heating distribution to be considered in the taxonomy is to respect the definition in the energy efficiency directive. At the moment, the ED directive defines efficient district heating as district heating system using at least 50% of renewable energy, 50% waste heat, 75 cogenerate heat, or 50% of a combination such energy and heat. At the moment, the ED is under revision, so it will be quite an old definition for the moment, but today now is still this one. So to label as green an investment into district heating distribution. So we are not talking about heat supply, heat production. The district heating network should be efficient as defined in the EED. So what about fossil fuel cogeneration of heat cool? That's one of the most important, I would say, question in district heating, because we know that unfortunately not all the district heating network are completely, I would say, renewable based. So a lot of them are based on cogeneration of heat and fossil fuel based, in particular gas. So the taxonomy regulation neither include or exclude natural gas in the taxonomy. There's no any clear mention, and a complementary delegated act in the future should be adopted to cover natural gas and related technology. So at the moment, no any fossil fuel are taxonomy compliant for the screening criteria. The Commission decided, because of the big debate around it, to regulate the role of gas not only in the district heating through a different legislative initiative. But of course, all these transitional activities considered based on gas should respect the limits of the EU taxonomy regulation. So sorry, I rush a lot. It's a very complicated matter. I hope I was, I would say, as clear as possible. Thank you very much. If you have any question, you can, of course, write me directly on my email, and I will be glad to speak about taxonomy with you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Taxonomy is a huge topic. So yeah, no wonder you struggled to fit that in kind of 5 minutes. I'm not surprised by that. I wanted to ask, so this is existing district heating and new build district heating. Is there any size? So if it's, you know, a gas boiler supplying an apartment block versus, you know, a Swedish large scale district heating, are they both considered in for taxonomy?
Yeah, the size of district heating, it's not say considered. So no matter the size of the network, you know, as long as the network is compliant with the definition of efficient district heating, so we are looking at the heat supply in this sense, it can become taxonomy compliant. It's a little bit of say confusing also from the point of view of the taxonomy, because we are talking about the distribution of heat, but to label green this distribution, we have to look at the heat supply, so the heat generation as defined in the EED, so renewable, waste heat, and so on. If we want to invest in the heat supply, we have to look at different category in the taxonomy. So generation of heat by energy or geothermal energy and so on. So I can understand the taxonomy, I would say, is not flawless. It's something that should be, I would say, fine-tuned and should be explained much more by the Commission to the investors, because I'm noticing a lot of confusion. It's a natural confusion, of course. So let's see how the Commission will, I would say, communicate more about this topic.
Yeah, totally. It is, yeah, complex, obviously, but important, and great to see we're moving in the right direction, right? So yeah, there may be a few hiccups in the beginning, but hopefully they will get sorted out. I'd like to invite all the speakers back for the more formal Q&A side. I'm just kind of going to give about 5 minutes for this, because I would like to kick off for the brainstorming. I know we've got some pretty prestigious participants in this webinar, so we'd also like to get thoughts from you. But just quickly, kind of on the taxonomy, Tobias, what are your thoughts about the taxonomy? Is this going to be a game changer, or is this going to be something, you know, that is just part of compliance?
Well, that's a good question. So I think there's different sides and different perspectives on that. First of all, at least the ambition of the Commission is to make it a game changer.
Oh, sorry, I think we've lost your mic. Oh, there we go.
What I was trying to say is the trouble, like always, is in the details, and how the Commission will step by step be implementing it. And if the entire process becomes too bureaucratic, then of course much potential is wasted. And second aspect I would like to mention is that the overall action plan and the taxonomy as a part of it is not very much aligned with carbon pricing, although both instruments are heading towards the same direction. And so I think a lot of more coordination is needed, and that would also to make it easier to understand for the population in Europe, for example, for companies, but also for investors. And so from my perspective, we need much more alignment on that issue.
Yes, very much agree. We forecast out the EU ETS here at BNEF, and at the moment our forecast is €108 per tonne for 2030. So if that's correct, and I have to say we have been relatively accurate in the past, it's going to start having a bit of an impact, but agree, bureaucracy can sometimes get in the way, unsurprisingly. Olivier, I'd like to come to you. From an investor's perspective, carbon pricing, taxonomy, are these kind of helpful regulatory signs, or as Tobias said, does it just kind of compound on, the fact that different markets have different regulations and it becomes all a bit complex?
On the taxonomy front, certainly it is quite complex. As Gabriele mentioned, I personally haven't gotten my head fully around it just yet. I think obviously the carbon pricing for us has much more of a direct impact, and I think it's definitely that is definitely very important, a very important tool. We see a lot of markets where actually the relative economics of a sustainable district heating network versus a gas alternative, just the economics do not stack up, and that's something clearly the carbon pricing can actually help balance out. But we are yet to see that happening in a lot of markets, actually.
Yeah, fair. I think across the world there are a number of carbon pricing schemes, but the level of which, I think it's over half of all countries with the carbon pricing is actually set at $10 or less. So, as you can imagine, it's not really having a huge impact. New Zealand included, I'll put my hands up for that. But yeah, hopefully we're moving in the right direction. Okay, to avoid me just bombarding everyone with questions, given we're going to the interactive session, I can keep asking. So I think what we're going to do, I believe Jack's going to put a link to Miro in the chat now. If you click on this, but keep your audio on in Teams, we'll keep communicating via Teams. But if you click on that link, we're going to be taken to a web page where there's a bunch of post-its, and I can talk you through how we're going to work with this. So I'll give people a minute or so to get onto it. I've seen, a few of you make it over. So if you just click on that link, hopefully, it should take you there. We've got 9 successful people so far. No pressure, guys, but you're doing well so far. So we do have a question while we're going over. So from an investor perspective, so I believe, Olivier, you might be up for this one too. Is there a res technology or approach to district heating and cooling that seems more interesting from a financial return point of view? So that's kind of what should we be using to fuel these networks? Solar tech, waste recovery, fuel cells? What do you think?
Yeah, no, this is a very important question, and something obviously we'll take a look at very closely. We as investors, we only invest in what we call established, proven technology. So we will not be taking much technology risk. But there are actually quite a few of these sustainable heat sources that are proven, certainly. The ones you list, I think that the obvious one, waste heat recovery, for me is always a very attractive heat source to look at. It often is very cheap. You have to look at obviously the credit worthiness and the stability of the heat source, but that usually is the cheapest. But we look also at heat pumps. A combination, for example, of a heat pump and a data center can be a very attractive proposition. Heat from energy from waste facilities tends to be, are considered sustainable. That's perhaps maybe a bit debatable, but they are certainly high temperature, very constant, and also very cheap. And then it will depend from market to market, certainly. But we look at biomass, geothermal, although not deep, ultra deep geothermal, waste heat, and etc.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly. There's kind of a variety with district heating, right? That's why taxonomy is an interesting one where, the transitional question, can it be district heating based on gas, given you can kind of switch out to different technologies very easily. Before I harass you guys anymore, I will explain this platform. So we've got kind of 4 buckets, but you can contribute to any of them you like in any order. So what you do is double click on a poster and bring it over. So we're interested in who you think the investors are. So what are the key investors? Is it, ASPA, or is it, banks, or, you can do it at any kind of level you think. Please feel free to just start populating these. Investor interests and needs. So why would you invest in district heating? Why do you think people should invest in district heating? What are the main interests that we need to get out there? Financial instruments. So Tobias covered this, right, in terms of there's a bunch that we can use. So which ones do you think are going to be important? What does equity look like? Is it, pension funds, that kind of stuff? Are there any alternative financing mechanisms you think could be more effective for district heating that we're not using at the moment? Crowdfunding, for instance, is an example of that. And then lastly, policy and legal frameworks. I think across the board with heat decarbonisation, policy is playing a big role in some of these markets where we're seeing change occur. So the Nordics, right, they have an incredibly high carbon price and support for their renewable heating technologies. So what is it we need to see in some of the markets that aren't moving in terms of policy to really move this forward? So I've seen a few of you have already got the hang of this. So please keep populating. There is no wrong answer, I can assure you. And it may be that, something that you had experience with that you think everybody knows, and you're like, come on, guys, you work in district heating, you should know this. We may not. So please, don't feel like you can't put anything on here. There's definitely no wrong answer. I would like to, while we're kind of populating a few, Gabrielle, I'd like to come to you about the kind of transitional issue with the taxonomy or complicating factor. What does that look like for district heating investments that are currently on gas? Would it be that, you can do a gas network and then switch it to heat pumps in 10 years' time or 20 years' time? What does that look like?
Emma, we cannot disregard, I would say, gas role in this reheating. We would be just, I would say, idealistic. We need to take into consideration that the taxonomy raised a lot of national interest, in particular from Eastern European countries, where the fossil fuel, not just the gaseous fossil fuel, but also solid gas fossil fuel, had a big role, not just in this reheating, also in the economies. So of course, the taxonomy could, I'll say, in some way revolutionize a little bit all the the financial markets investment in the economy. So this transitional level was, I would say, an escamotage. I'd say a shortcut for the Commission to have, I would say, a gray zone where to play. Also, this gray zone was actually very true for this reheating. So, as you all know, that in this reheating we have three different kinds of markets or situation where we have countries where we are already in 2050. So the taxonomy can, I would say, is I would say almost useless, because you don't need to invest in green activities where everything is already green. Then we have the Central Europe, Southern Europe, like France, Germany, where of course this transition is happening, so taxonomy can be really a booster. And then we have part of Germany and Eastern Europe where you cannot have this black and white approach. And of course, in that case, taxonomy could even hinder this transition, because of course, when you are super emitting, highly emitting this heating network, you cannot pass from 100 to 0 in one day. And in that case, we need this transitional role. And we need, in some way, a way to, I would say, not to, I would say, crowd out completely private investment. If we don't have any, I would say, green activity where to invest, investors just go to other countries. And say they will escape from countries that will need most these investments. I don't know if I'm clear. So, of course, I like this declining threshold for gas. Of course, we need a declining threshold. We need to say to the investor, okay, if you want to have a long-term investment in gas, you won't be taxonomy compliant anymore in 10 years, something like that. So that's a good sign. So we need to keep this transitional label very clear. We need to, say, be coherent on that. I don't want the Commission to change their mind in a fortnight. So overnight. Sorry. So. Yeah, of course, we need some flexibility in taxonomy, in particular for the countries I mentioned, but also we need coherency and long-term vision from the taxonomy. A certain, I would say, message: you won't be green forever, even if you invest in gas.
Yeah, exactly. I think district heating's an interesting one, right? Where if you can plug and play sources, you're at the advantage, right? That you can decarbonize. So, you want that flexibility, but at the same time, these gas assets aren't cheap. They've still got long lifetimes. If you're only giving 10 years for the gas asset, you're cutting kind of 2/3 of that lifetime short, and you're going to have to reinvest early. Tobias, I'd like to pick up. We've got regulation coming through a lot here on the whiteboard. There is a multitude of approaches. I think the UK is thinking about it at the moment. It currently has next to nothing, although there are patches where district heating fits in different types of regulation, which can make things worse, I think. But how do you think we optimise regulation for district heating? Is there kind of a better solution to the one we have at the moment?
Is it a question to the audience or to me? Sorry, to the rest of the
I was going to pull Tobias into this one.
Okay. Yeah, maybe if I link my answer to also, or try to link at least my answer to what Gabriele just mentioned. I think, for example, when I'm talking to banks or other financial institutions, they are struggling very much with the taxonomy for different reasons. One reason is what Olivier mentioned, namely the complexity. And from a practical point of view, from a financial institution's point of view, I would say, what I get as a feedback, it has to be made much leaner. Otherwise, it becomes too bureaucratic, and that leads to rising overheads at the financial institution side. And since they are already carrying around a lot of regulatory burden in other areas, so that makes things more complex and also would harm the economy because it would limit growth potential. So from that side, and what I'm also hearing from the market is, when I especially talk to credit or loan specialists, they say that, well, we are, after 2 years working on these issues, we are now, our systems are running up, our risk management systems, our credit analysis systems, for example, and all the processes related to that, they are about ready to be started. But when we talk to the clients, we do not know where to get the data from, the carbon data, for example. And that's also a big issue. So, for example, another sector, but related to district heating networks, that's buildings. So the simple question, if a commercial real estate owner needs a new loan, or be it a private individual wanting to buy an apartment or to refurbish a single family house, then it becomes complex because they do not have the data, but the banks are requiring that. And I think that on a larger scale is the same. The same is true for district heating and cooling networks. And for example, what I also hear, for example, in our area, we have lots of innovative family-owned companies, small and medium-sized enterprises, and they are already also struggling very much with that because they are already feeling it. They need to provide the data. They know that carbon footprint analysis will have an impact on their financing conditions, but they do not know how to deal with that now. And I think that's a lot of issues that have to be solved fast.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Olivia, you picked up on this, the kind of fragmented market that is district heating kind of in a lot of countries at the moment. How big a barrier is that for investment? Is it, you'd prefer to be dealing with obviously one company that has, a lot of expertise versus a lot of, people struggling potentially with modelling long-term cash flows? How big an impact is that having with investment?
So the fragmented nature of markets is not really a problem from our perspective. I think what's important is actually having project developers on the ground, right? So people actually who are day in, day out actually trying to make those projects happen, because as I mentioned, it is hugely complicated and you need to have people who have the skills, but also the motivation and the drive. I think it's very often an entrepreneurial affair. So I think that there are two models that I see emerging. One is very much local authority, sort of public authority driven type of networks. And then there's another model, which is more the private developer led model. We like both. I think we have more experience working with private developers. So that's really the key for me, is to have people out there actually who have the skills, the motivation to make projects happen. That's the most important.
Yeah, great, understandable. And while I've got you, what's your thoughts on shortening payback times? Do you think it's possible? How big a barrier is this? What can we really do about this? Because these are infrastructure projects, right, which once they're on the ground, provide a great asset class, like you say, but but upfront they are, they have long payback periods. So how do we get around that?
Yeah, no. So I don't think, in general, I think it's fair to say this is not an asset class which is meant for people with very short payback periods, right? That's probably fair to say. There probably are some exceptions out there, but no. So I think it's important to have the right type of capital going into these assets. And we are one. So Asper is in a particular part of the value chain. So we position ourselves, not at the very, very early stage. You do have people, usually it's developers doing that work to take it from nothing to something which is a project is looking like it's going to work. We take it usually from that stage onwards of late development, construction, early growth phase. That is a different risk profile and commands maybe slightly shorter payback periods for our investment. And then I think there is a natural kind of handover to longer term type of capital, more patient capital, more with lower risk return profiles. The pension funds will be the obvious candidate here. So this is at least how I picture it in my mind. Sort of the three key parts of the value chain that present different risk return profiles, and the key is to find the right type of capital at each stage.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think our analysis on greenfield networks, the shortest payback period we got was 12 years, which, as you can imagine, for people looking for kind of 3 to 5 years, it's not the right asset class for them for sure. So, but staging networks can be an option, obviously. I'd like to ask all three of you. You've seen the board now. We've got quite a few contributions. Anything that's surprising you? Did you read one that you think is particularly interesting? your own perhaps. No one knows. I think there's no names on this, so if you want a bit of self-promotion, feel free. But yeah, any of these, you've seen that you're like, oh yeah, we haven't thought about this, or this is really important. I see everyone frantically reading like I've set homework.
It's a comment that I can transform into a question to Olivier and Tobias maybe on financial instruments. Of course, I'm not a super expert, but I know that district heating still relying too much on public subsidies and public money. So we're talking about this leveraging of private investment. What's your opinion on this public money role in district heating, in particular for innovation? Do you think this role of institutional investor could in some way crowd out private investors, so have the opposite effect? Maybe private investors just waiting for I would say this abatement of high upfront cost subsidized by the public, and they want to invest. What's your opinion? Sorry if Emma, I take your role, but I would say thinking about that is something that it's my curiosity to think, to hear from more expert than me.
I don't know. Happy for you to jump in.
Maybe I start with the theoretical side, and Olivier can then join from the more practical side. So, actually, my impression, at least for Germany and some other countries, is that I do not really see a crowding out. It's rather just filling the gaps, filling the investment gaps, and yeah. But I think we should move more intensively in the right direction of public-private partnerships and that kind of issues in order to combine the advantages of public funding, so like as an incentive for private investors to join, and also the advantages of private investments, which means more market-oriented behavior, more focus on efficiency and return and risk optimization. And maybe that's part of the answer, but especially with what Olivier mentioned with patient capital, what is the case here, I think we need at least some upfront public investment in order to attract other investors as well, and in order to mitigate the upfront risk for private investors.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, Olivia, I'll let you in 2 seconds, just to say, guys, we're still in on the post-its, and I know you're probably listening to these great answers, but please feel free to keep populating. And after Olivia's answer, I'll get a few of you to ask or read out your post-its, if that's okay. Sorry, please, Olivia.
Yeah, no, so I think this is a question which probably would deserve a lot more time to discuss, but. I mean, there is a really wide range of ways that actually, the public authorities sort of at large can actually influence and should probably influence the development of district heating networks, and that ranges from, yes, sort of plugging the gap, as Tobias just mentioned. That's, for example, what we are seeing, in the UK. That's exactly the approach of the UK government at the moment. They set up this heat network investment project, which essentially does exactly that. It aims to plug a gap. It looks at basically the project economics. It looks at the returns they're getting. They've set a threshold return, which I think is maybe high single digits, so maybe 10%. And they say, okay, therefore, we need to come in and provide X amount of capital upfront as a grant or a subsidized loan. That's a typical example. But on the other end of the spectrum, you could have very much sort of pull type of measures that can be put in place. For example, directives on energy efficiency, which are pushing certain real estate owners to actually look at connecting to a district heating network because they know they will have to do something about their current situation. It could be shifting a bit of the tax burden away from electricity bills, to gas bills, which will obviously change the economics a little bit in a similar fashion than a tax on CO2 would, and actually then naturally almost incentivize people to look for alternatives, which would be a more market-oriented way of doing it. And I think ultimately a mix of these sort of measures is always going to be necessary. If you look at markets like Sweden, they were not built just with market forces. They were built because the Swedish government decided that it was necessary and they didn't have any gas. And I think that's, in the Netherlands, you do have, some SD plus tariffs that are awarded for sustainable heat production as well, which obviously helps the numbers relative to gas. So I think it is always going to be necessary. It can take many, many different shapes and forms, but yeah, it's something that is going to have to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, right? It's like if public funding's available, of course you're going to take it, but that public funding won't always be around forever. Not having gas is just such a foreign concept living in the UK, where almost all the homes run on gas here, right? So yeah, I mean, we often put the Nordics up on a pedestal of like, beautiful decarbonised heating, and there's obviously some factors like no gas that play into that, of course. Now, I'd like to turn it over to the audience. We've got a few minutes left. Is there anyone that would like to unmute? I know that seems like quite a daunting task after you've been on mute this entire time, but you want to read out your post-it or you want to ask a question in person, yeah, please, anyone feel free.
Don't be shy, guys.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes, this is Luca Ferrari. I have a question for everyone who wants to answer, actually. Maybe Olivier is the most appropriate one. How do you feel about building a partnership with public utilities and municipalities? Because sometimes it's not always an easy relationship as a private investor at the moment.
Yes, so well, municipalities, local authorities will always have a very, very important role to play, right? This is undeniable. It's always going to be the case. And we as investors are definitely open to partnerships, and we often look to actually create good relationships with the municipalities in which we build networks. It's a hygiene factor almost. Now, we have only on one occasion actually had a jointly owned company with the local municipality, but that that worked out fine. But it is not always easy. I agree. Ultimately, it's not for us to decide. It will be down to the local authority. Very often, they will have they'll be at the steering wheel and decide how they want to develop the project, and then it's up to the investors to either adapt or decide not to invest.
Great, thank you.
Maybe I can add or ask an additional question, because it popped up in my eye that someone posted, maybe it was Luca Ferrari, but that's just a question, energy cooperative financing. So for example, looking at the high debt levels and rising debt levels of public institutions, municipalities, federal governments, and so on. So would that be an alternative way of organizing and treaty networks, some kind of joint venture? So, for example, public and private investors could join. Of course, then we have the voting right issues, but it would be a cooperative way, and at least in Germany, on smaller scale, renewables issues, the 800 existing cooperatives in Germany were basically part of the solution leading to the energy transition. So what do you think of that?
I think any scheme that actually helps community engagement, customer engagement, and buy-in is hugely helpful. That is really important, right? I mean, ultimately, when you build a district heating network, you are often building something that people don't really know about, they don't really understand, is creating traffic issues, and maybe a bit of noise and a bit of dust, etc. during the construction phase, people are annoyed, and unless you actually really bring them onto a journey and involve them, maybe even as a cooperative investing in the project, that could be a very neat way of doing that. You raise a good point around governance. It's very important to have a very clean governance structure, of course, but that can be doable.
Yeah, unfortunately, district heating is not necessarily the sexiest investment class that we possibly have. We talk about it in terms of, you might get an electric car because, it looks great and you can kind of show off, but, revealing whether you have a gas boiler or a clean district heat network is not usually something that comes up at parties, I have to say, in my experience. Not sure about you guys in the circles you hang out with. So I just think finally, if we've got one more audience member that would like to come forward, please feel free.
Maybe one further question from my side, since you mentioned that it hasn't been the sexiest asset class so far, but maybe someone has a breaking idea how to make it more sexy. And I mean, that's basically one of the key questions we are working on, at least in our work packages in the project. So how make it an asset class and how make it ideally a sexy asset class?
Tobias, in my opinion, this communication aspect on district heating is one of the most important one, in particular in innovation project, because as Emma said, I would say the weak point of district heating is that its beauty is hidden, it's underground. So in some way, people see a Tesla, but they don't see the pipes, under their feet. So in many projects, we are, I would say, advocating for this consumer engagement, stakeholder engagement to explain better, in particular in little towns where district heating is a major role. I would say to how this participation and also the potential role of this cooperative, of this citizen financing can have a great role. So if you give people, I'll say, a long-term vision, and I'll say you can ride this green wave that is racing in many countries, in particular in Germany, for example. I'll say you can give, I'll say, a great, I'll say. I don't know how to say in English, but I'll say you can change the opinion people have on this reheating. Just not, I'll say, dirty pipes in the ground, but it's something that can contribute to make greener they own little town. So yeah, this communication aspect is super important, in particular from public authority to the citizens.
Yeah, I think we definitely talk in a language that can be a barrier. So, explaining to people that they want a warm house, or, it's an environment in which they can live in and enjoy, rather than, it's a gas boiler or it's district heating. It's, it's continuity of supply. It's the fact, yeah, your house is warm when you get home, or, whatever. We've got one final question. Olivia, you're on the hook again. Sorry, I think you've been a bit bombarded today, but what does cooling do to the investor perspective of a network?
In short, I think it's a fantastic addition. I think there are lots of complementarities between heating and cooling networks. In fact, this is at the core of what the D2 Grids project that we're also working on actually looks at, is a loop between the cooling and the heating, where, for example, we're talking about sexy. I think this is the sexiest thing around, being able to use the waste heat from a supermarket to actually heat the building next door, and vice versa. I think is extremely attractive, and actually certainly goes in the right direction. So I think that for me, so this whole concept of 5th generation district heating and cooling is definitely the way forward. And when I look at some of the projects that exist already out there, like, for example, the Mindwater project in the Netherlands, it is when you go and visit that type of project, you are, I mean, when I see the project, I see the future of urban sort of heating and cooling projects. So certainly a very, very keen advocate of it.
Yeah, precisely. I have to say I am standing in the middle of central London, and I can't say cooling is a big need for us, but I can imagine in other countries, hopefully you're experiencing a bit more of a summer than we are here. We've got a bit more of a comment here, which is, you know, how cool is it to have bicycle tracks or routes in a town or city region? Yeah, exactly. So, you know, maybe we are just not in the Tesla camp, but how can we at least go towards that? I think, you know, we've got 2 minutes to go, and I'd like to give you all back that time, but just to say thank you very much to our panelists today. It's been a great interactive session from my thoughts. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully we can do this again soon. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, everyone. See you.